Appreciate you tonight. My name is Jim Campbell-Spickler. I am the Sequoia Park Zoo Director. Happy to welcome you to our 12th annual conservation lecture. This is the second speaker in our series this year. Our event is sponsored by Papa and Markley's. If you need to step out, maybe leave early or use the restroom, let's please use the back doors. Restrooms are on the right. If you need to leave the facility, you can just circle back around and go out the way you came in. Do watch out for our resident skunk, who happens to be prowling tonight. Very friendly. He never sprays. It's always nice just to tiptoe and be, say nice things, and yeah, it should be fine. And also ask you to please silence your phones. You can do that for us, that'd be great. And I'm very excited about tonight's speaker. I've known him for quite a while. He's a friend, a colleague. We've published together. We've suffered a little bit together in the field during some very wet and cold field research on rope in tall redwoods and also in the hardwood canopies of the northern forest here. So we also have in common that we studied the same salamander for our master's program, but he's taken things to a whole new level. And it's kind of a funny story, but a lot of the research he's going to show you tonight, where it came from, was the ideas came from a project we were working on together. It was a shoot for National Geographic where we were filming salamanders. It's another thing he does. He's quite a well-known wrangler of salamanders for film and television. Yeah, but there was some observations that were observed during one of the shoots that he said, I think there's something there. What is going on? And I was a bit of a concern. I'm like, nah, it's nothing. I was wrong. He's going to show you it all tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our Director of Conservation, Dr. Ruth Mock, and she's going to give our guest speaker the proper introduction.
Yes. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks for coming. I'm Ruth, as Jim said, and I'm part of our Conservation Advisory Committee here at the zoo. And the job of our committee is to support our zoo's conservation vision. So we're raising public awareness about different conservation issues that we think are relevant and selecting field conservation projects to support through our zoo's conservation fund. And this lecture series is one of our programs, and you guys get to come and participate in, that's supported by this fund. And our upcoming conservation grants are going to be opening soon, and those will be due in January. And those are also awarded from the zoo's conservation fund. So those are some things you can be looking forward to. This whole series is organized by Michaela Gunther, who is not here tonight, but he's a professor at Cal Poly Humboldt. And our committee does a lot of work for achieving our mission, and Michaela just does an awesome job on this series every single year. This is our 12th year doing it. So even though she's not here tonight, I just want to give her a round of applause because she's so awesome and brings amazing people here like Christian Brown. So we are live streaming this on Zoom as well and on Facebook Live. So we want to say hi to our virtual participants tonight. For our virtual participants, if they want to ask questions, they can ask questions in our Zoom chat or typing into the Facebook comments. We have everyone's audio and video off to enhance our streaming experience. And we have various accessibility options now on our streaming platforms. So we have closed captioning on, and if folks can give us feedback about that, that would be great. So I am thrilled to properly introduce our speaker tonight. It's Christian Brown. Christian began his career as a scientist, educator, and activist at Humboldt State University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in wildlife and conservation biology. From there, he earned his master's degree in biology at Humboldt State University, which is now Cal Poly Humboldt. And he's currently a PhD candidate in the Integrative Biology Department at the University of South Florida in Tampa. So his research examines the life history of amphibians with the goal of increasing awareness about their conservation needs. And additionally, Christian has mentored STEM students as an outreach instructor with with the Museum of Science and Industry at Tampa. And he has spearheaded the recent fight to save the University of South Florida Forest Preserve from development. So, he's also a wildlife biologist for international documentaries, which Jim was just talking about, mostly filming salamanders in the redwoods. So thanks for joining us today, Christian. Come on up.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Ruth and Jim, for those wonderful introductions. I'll stand over here so I don't block the screen. Thanks to all of you guys for coming out to listen. I know it's late, I know it's cold, but I spent a lot of time on this, and it means a lot to me that you're here to listen. So, as long as you guys are interested, I'll keep doing this. This is working. So, right. Sorry, I'm going to stand on this side.
System here.
Right. Yeah. So today I'm going to tell you guys about wandering salamanders, a lot about how they jump, why, generate lift, and things like that. But I really hope to kind of take it a step further and work in, why this matters, and then also like how it pertains to conservation. There we go. Yeah, so a quick overview before we just dive right into all of this. I want you guys to kind of know where we're at as we move through today. I'm just going to start by giving you a quick overview of lungless salamanders in general. So wandering salamanders, they're just one of many lungless salamanders, and we'll talk about the diversity within that family. Before we jump into like what the salamanders in the redwood trees are doing, we want to kind of know about their family, where they come from. Then I'm going to dive into my research, all of the new stuff here, so like how our royal salamanders jump, how they parachute and glide and maneuver in the air, and then how they generate the lift to actually do this stuff. And then lastly, I'd like to talk about how these organisms and other organisms across the world are shaped by tall trees. And I think everybody in this room has probably been shaped by tall trees too. So in a way, we're all kind of connected to the wandering salamander. We are connected to the redwood forest that we call home. All of us in this room, the salamanders, everything that lives in the canopy. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And just to start, the lungless salamanders, they breathe with moist skin and mouth tissues. So they don't have lungs like you or I. They get their oxygen in another way. And because of this, or partially because of this, they've radiated into tons of different niches across the world. And they are the largest and most diverse family in the world of salamanders, I should say. This is their family tree. Oh, so back really quick so we can look at their family tree. This is their family tree. So we know how they're kind of related to each other genetically. And we've described almost 500 species across 28 genera. And like I said, they've been able to radiate into a lot of different niches. So they span 4 continents. They're all over the globe. And you can find them in like traditional salamander habitats like streams, in forest floors, and under the ground and under logs. But you can also find them like up in trees, in caves, even in the Sierra Nevada, like up in the tundra, there's hydromantes. So they're all over the world. They've spread everywhere, partially because they don't have to go back to bodies of water to reproduce. So it's a really cool family, just in general. And this is a little bit of the diversity that you'll see within the family. This is just 5 of those close to 500 species that have been described. These 3 in the middle you should know here from the redwood forest. So you may have encountered these. And I want to go through one by one and just kind of explore the diversity within the family before we jump into how salamanders move around in the redwood canopy, because it all is connected. So starting with like your classic salamander habitat. This is a streamside habitat in Appalachia. And if you've ever been to Appalachia, or if you've ever caught salamanders in these streamside habitats like designated Sequoia, you might notice that their limbs are, pretty standard for a salamander, right? It's a tetrapod, it has 4 arms and legs. And if you take the limbs and you push them towards each other, not just for fun, this is a way that we measure relative limb length in salamanders. If you do that, and you push the limbs towards each other, you'll notice that there's 3 to 4 costal folds in between the adpressed limbs. So there's a gap. So if you push the limbs towards each other, a gap remains between the limbs. And so this is the way that scientists measure relative limb length. This is designated Sequoia from a stream. If you move on to the redwood forest here now, raise your hand in this room. How many people have seen this scene right here on the left? So if you've ever flipped any log in the Sequoia Park, right back here, you've probably seen many of these slender salamanders living underneath. You may have even thought they were worms or something, because their limbs are so tiny that it's almost adorable. And if you take their limbs and you push them towards each other, you'll find that there are actually 11 to 13 costal folds in between the adpressed limbs, which is almost all of them, right? That's a lot. So their limbs are highly, highly reduced, and that makes sense because they need to burrow underground. So big legs might get in the way. So that's just, 2 species so far. Another species that you might recognize from the redwood forest is Ensatina schultzii. So if you go out, maybe tonight, or maybe on a slightly wetter night, they might even just be walking around on the forest floor. You can also find them under logs next to those slender salamanders. And if you take their limbs and you push them towards each other, again, you play our fun little leg game here, you'll learn that there are about 1 to 2 costal folds remaining between the adpressed limbs. So far, all the species we have seen, there's a gap between the adpressed limbs. But if you go up into the trees and you climb into the world's tallest redwood trees like this one, and you find these epiphytic fern mats that grow at the crotches of the branches in the trunk, Aedes vagrans is famous for living there. And that's what Jim discovered in his masters, or helped to discover, is how they live in this world, what habitats they're using, and how they move around in that world. And so we needed that work to build upon. We would have been nowhere without that work. And one interesting thing about this salamander, or a few interesting things about this salamander, is that if you adpress the limbs, there is no gap. They actually overlap by more than 1 costal fold, 1.5 costal folds in this species. So that the relative limb length is much longer, especially compared to like slender salamanders and things like that. You also see semi-webbed feet. So if you look really closely at those feet, they're not fully webbed. There's definitely gaps between the toes, but there is some webbing at the beginning of the digits. And so they have semi-webbed feet, and they have really big square toe tips that help them climb. So we're starting to see unique morphologies in the limbs, the feet, and then this organism is also really flat. And we'll come back to that later. So they're kind of flattened. And the last one I want to show you, again, there are 500 species in this family, so we'd be here all night. But the 5th and last species I'm going to show you today lives in Mexico and other caves around Central America. It's the Bigfoot splayfoot salamander, or Chiropteran magnipeds. And this salamander, if you adpress its limbs, it overlaps by 2 costal folds, so even longer limbs relative to the body than Aedes vagrans. And this is sort of an extreme salamander, not just in limb length, but also in its webbed feet. So if you look here at the feet, this is the most webbed foot on Earth for any extant salamander species. So of all the salamander species that are still here with us today, this one has the most webbing in its feet. And so the whole point here, there are lots of similarities and differences between salamanders from this family, but the whole point is that there are massively different sizes and shapes when it comes to their legs and their hands, right? So if we look at their feet one by one, this is that California slender salamander that we looked at on the far bottom left. You can see that it has the smallest foot of all the salamanders that are displayed here. Ensatina is on the bottom right, and you can see that it has a much larger foot than Batrachoceps, but there's no webbing at all. No webbing whatsoever. Aedes, we don't have an Aedes vagrant on this figure. This was somebody else's research, but we have an Aedes lugubrus, which is super closely related. We're going to kind of use this thing. And an Aedes lugubrus has partially webbed feet, just like a vagrant's, and you can also see the large square toe tips here. And the last one I'm going to show you is the Lungless Salamanders, which is as close to Chiropteran magnipeds as we were able to get. We went to Mexico and didn't find them. Sad day. But we did catch Lungless Salamanders, and they have almost fully webbed feet. So the point here is that salamander feet are different. They're different in size, they're different in shape. And all of this is going to be important later, specifically the feet. But in general, the fact that they have generalized tetrapod body plans. So they have a body, they have a head, they have a tail, and they have 4 arms and legs, right? That's a very basic body plan for vertebrates with 4 arms and legs. If you look out in this audience, most of us even look like that. Your tail went away in development, but everything else is still there. You've got 4 arms and legs and a body and a head. And so, yeah, they're generalized. So it really helps us kind of draw distinctions between, or helps us make connections between them and other animals on Earth. And they're still morphologically distinct. So we can still actually compare and contrast them, which is really nice. And we know their family tree. They have really well-established genetics. So this kind of makes them like an ideal family for studying them in science. Specifically studying things like how they move around and how they jump. So if their legs look different, then their locomotion might be different, right? If their bodies look different, then they might have to move across the landscape differently, especially if they're living in a stream versus a tree versus a cave. These are very different worlds. So the first thing that I want to talk about tonight is how salamanders jump, how these lungless salamanders jump. And this is something that had actually been done before. In 2013, designated Sequoia, which is this species right here, from the Appalachian streamside habitat that we talked about, had its jumping described. And they basically describe a method in which the salamander bends its body and rapidly unbends it, powering the jump with its axial musculature, and then it kind of pole holds over one leg. So this is different than most things with 4 arms and legs. Most things with 4 arms and legs, think of your dog, think of a frog, think of any vertebrate tetrapod you can think of. They jump by pushing their legs against the ground. Even you, if you wanted to jump, you'd have to push your legs against the ground to jump up. But salamanders don't do that. Their escape response almost looks more like a fish. So in the water, fish are famous for this sea start escape response, where they'll bend and rapidly unbend, propelling themselves forward and away from the predator. Salamanders do the same thing here, but on land, and they use a leg to kind of pull over. So this jump is not being powered by their legs. They call this, in this paper here, the hip twist jump. So we'll refer to this as the hip twist jump, and this is how lungless salamanders jump according to the literature. But the thing is, we also know that arboreal salamanders jump. That was designated as a Sequoia. It's from a stream. But this is an Aedes vagrant, the wandering salamander from the redwood crown. And this is actually footage from that very documentary that Jim talked about in the introduction. It's called The Mighty Northwest, Rise of the Redwood Giants. So if you want to try to look this up, it aired in May of 2018. But on the set of this documentary, they wanted us to film jumping in salamanders because they had heard that if you climb the tree, and you go into their habitat in the redwood canopy, and they know you're coming, that they'll either jump from the fern mat, or they can jump from your hand. They jump readily, basically. And the producers of this documentary knew that, and they wanted us to film it. And so this is where, Jim's part of the introduction comes in. We're watching them jump on these fancy cameras with Nat Geo, and I started to think like, wow, like they're always landing on their bellies. They always land upright. It didn't matter how they jumped or how they flung themselves off the wood. They seemed to land perfectly. And it was happening way too fast to see what was happening. But again, I told Jim, I think they're doing something. Maybe they're controlling their fall. And he was like, nah, let's just focus on what we need to do here. But yeah, I moved on and I couldn't stop thinking about like how that salamander's jumping. And a few things came to mind. When I checked the literature, the first thing that I noticed is that the only species to have their jumping described live by stream sides. So Eurycia, Desmognathus, and Plethodon were the only genera who had their jumping described, and all of them are from the same habitat. So it makes sense that they all use the same jump. But what about Aedes? What about the tree-dwelling and the cave-dwelling salamanders? Do they jump any differently? So that was kind of the first question. We weren't thinking about parachuting or gliding or anything like that. The first question was, how do these salamanders jump? Oh, sorry, people keep joining. I think that throws it off a bit. So the first question was, how do arboreal salamanders jump? And our hypothesis for this research question was that given their long legs, their exceptionally long legs, and given this really unique niche and habitat, that arboreal salamanders might differ in their jumping style and their skill. So the hip twist jump might not be the best way to go if you're in a tree, even though it works on the forest floor by a stream or something like that. So this was kind of the whole setup for this first chapter of our research. And to test this, what we did is we actually had to compare a lot of salamanders, not just the ones we were interested in. I compared 10 species of salamander, and they were from 4 different genera. So I tested Plethodon, Eurycia, Desmognathus, which had already been done, and I added Aedes to see how they differed. 9 of those species had never had their jumping described, so it was all kind of new stuff. And Aedes had never had jumping described ever. So I actually had 4 species of Aedes. So of the 9 species, I had Aedes vagrans, Aedes lugubrius, Aedes aeneus, and Aedes flavipunctatus. So we really dove into that genus of arboreal salamanders to see how they're doing it. And then I had the other ones to compare. And we used 5 individuals per species just to make sure we didn't get the Olympic jumper for that species or the couch potato who doesn't know how to jump or anything. We wanted to make sure we had a good representation of the whole species. So we grabbed 5 individuals and their performance was pretty much the same. I filmed all these jumps. So you can see one here on the right. This is kind of like a frame by frame of a salamander jumping off of a plank of wood. And I filmed all this at 500 frames per second so I could really analyze what was going on. So every frame was 0.002 seconds. And with that kind of resolution, you can really describe how they're moving and what they're doing. And you can see things that you ordinarily would just be arguing about in a garage. Like, I think they're doing something. Nah, things like that. If you slow it down with these cameras, there's no argument. You can see it in real time. I used a 105mm lens and I angled a mirror at 45 degrees. We'll show you the video in a second so that we can get both dorsal and lateral views. And we did this until, it took a long time, but we did this until we had 10 good jump trials for every individual salamander for a total of 500 jumps. So if you think jumping in salamanders sounds cool, make sure it's cool enough to you. that it's still cool 500 jumps later. She was for me, but I'm not sure if that would be for anybody else. So after a year of my life and 500 jumps, what I found can be broken down into these 3 lines and figures. So the first thing is that, sure enough, they do kind of differ in their jumping skill. Skill being measured in terms of takeoff velocity. So here on the y-axis, we have takeoff velocity, and you can see that amoebas, compared to all these other genera from the Appalachian Mountains, had significantly lower takeoff velocities. This line here is the average for all the other species, or for all species, and amoebas vagrants are just below average. So they don't take off nearly as quickly or with as much gusto, right? Horizontally speaking. So that was the first kind of realization, is that they jump more slowly. So, you know, at first glance, it seems like they're worse at getting away from predators, but we had to keep going and kind of learning from the videos. And the other thing that we noticed is that their style was different. So they did jump a little bit differently. They don't use the hip twist jump. They bend their body a lot less. And instead of pushing off with one foot like a pole vault, they almost toe off with both feet at the same time. And almost every time, which are these red bars, they push off from a vertical surface. So instead of pole vaulting with their foot on a horizontal surface, they go all the way up to the edge and they hang their big old feet and legs over, and then they push off like that. You know, all kind of subtle differences, but important, as we'll find out in a second. The last thing that we noticed is that even though they jumped more slowly, and even though they pushed off with 2 feet, they kind of did something better than the rest of them, and that was get into this parachute posture after they jumped. So when they were done jumping, sometimes before they were even done towing off, they were almost like in this perfect parachute posture, ready to go. And it almost seemed as if the fall was more important to them than the jump. And that's just kind of like the feeling that I got after watching 500 of these videos, was that, you know, what's happening here after the jump was just way more controlled and different. Sorry, again, I'm still learning to use this, than what happens in non-arboreal salamanders. So the takeaway is, in addition to what we saw on the previous screen, that they use 2 feet, and they push off from vertical surfaces, and they don't bend their bodies as much. The other things that we learned is that their takeoff velocity is kind of compared to a Anolis lizard's. It's like 0.6, 0.7 meters per second. This is cool because they also live in trees, and they're also kind of generalized tetrapods. So maybe it's just that that's an effective speed for getting away from predators. Both of these organisms have reached it. No need to jump any faster than that. So they both live in trees. They both jump wildly differently, using different muscles and biomechanics, but they still have the same escape speed. So that's kind of cool, like a convergent evolution right there in terms of escape speed. And the other cool thing that we saw is that jump style seems to impact their descent. So if they take off with 2 feet, they were able to get into the parachute posture faster, and their body was more stable already in the air. If you take off with 1 foot, you have to turn yourself and kind of fly yourself into the air sideways and then right yourself, which takes a little bit of time. So all of these things sort of led into the next couple of years of research. It was, you know, analyzing the results of one project just gives you more questions to start up another project. And so now that we knew how they jumped, and that they did jump very differently from other salamanders, and that all of these jumping differences seem to point to the need or the desire to control themselves in the air, we came up with new research questions and new hypotheses to kind of drive this research forward and learn what's going on. So the first research question was like, why not use the hip twist jump? Why jump more slowly than others? And we hypothesized that the stable body position is just like more effective at evading a predator. So for Aedes vagrants, it could be that getting off of the ledge in a good body position means more than getting off the ledge quicker. And the other research question was like, what's the utility of the skydiving posture? Like, sure, they do it, but are they just looking cool? Or does it actually do something for them, like mechanically? Are they actually like in a better spot because of it? Or is it just something they do? So that was kind of like what drove the next couple of years of research. And for this research, I actually had to do something a little bit differently. Oh, right. So instead of 10 species, we tested 4. And we just really honed in on these arboreal salamanders again the Aedes genus. And we had 1 Ensatina schultzii, well, we had 5 Ensatina schultzii for control species. So basically, this species does not jump. So Ensatina doesn't jump, it's not found in trees. So we sort of use it as a control of like, this is a non-arboreal salamander. It doesn't have any business being in the air in nature. So we use that as like our terrestrial control. The other salamanders sort of follow an arboreality gradient, with Aedes vagrans being the most arboreal. It's kind of like the most arboreal salamander on Earth. It lives in the world's tallest trees, and it potentially spends its whole life up there. So try to beat that. Aenetes lugubrious is also found in trees, but it's moderately arboreal. It's also found in like the Berkeley Rose Garden under rocks and stuff like that. And they also get way bigger. So they're not nearly as like conducive to living in the world's tallest trees, but they're still really arboreal. And Platypunctatus is within the same genus, but they're rounder, their legs are shorter, their feet aren't as big, and they're not really found in trees that much. I should note that Platypunctatus was recently broken into different species. So if you're thinking of the Klamath black salamander, that one might be a little bit different. I was testing one from down near Cloverdale, California. So this is the situation. We're jumping at 10 species. Now we whittled it down to 4 that we really think might be doing stuff in the air with one control. And all of these species were new to science. We didn't have any idea how any salamanders did anything in the air. So it was kind of like a nice low-hanging fruit project. Whatever we found was something, right? And what we did, first we tried a lot of things that didn't work. I tried dropping salamanders from balconies onto mattresses. No salamanders were hurt in making this research, but I tried dropping salamanders next to daisy chain GoPros. So I tried to put a bunch of GoPros together on a daisy chain and drop it all at the same time and just get lucky. None of this was scientific. None of this was repeatable. So it was kind of, you know, like it was cool to give it a try, but it wasn't working and it wasn't good science. So I called some researchers who had discovered gliding and other things. And I was like, what do I do? And they said, you should use a vertical wind tunnel. So this is when I struck up a collaboration with the UC Berkeley Animal Flight Lab. And this is a wind tunnel that they have in their lab that they've used to discover gliding in all types of geckos and tree frogs. And we dropped the salamander in here, and as you can see, it does not go upside down and it pitches back and forth wildly. We'll slow those videos down and take a look at what's happening. But what we essentially needed to do was control the wind speed so that we could simulate an extended descent without the animal moving. So we needed to be able to have like a nice frame where we could actually get everything in focus, where we could predict like that's where the animal's going to be, that's where the focus is going to be, that's where the behavior is going to be. We used higher powered cameras, and we filmed at 400 frames per second, and we used 3 different views so that I could like 3D reconstruct all of these movements and do math. And then we imaged 9 trials for individual for a total of 180 wind tunnel trials. So not quite 500, but these trials are massive. Each wind tunnel trial takes up 6 gigabytes of data on my hard drive, and I have 180 of them. So do the math. I have a lot of hard drives. Too many times here. There we go. What we found, or sorry, one last thing. So before what we found, what we did is we like compared and then recorded the capabilities of every species. And we described what their bodies were doing, like all the different movements and postures they were making. And then just to back up all of those biomechanics observations, we basically calculated, we call it the kinematics. This is just like the speeds and the maths of what they were doing. This is the velocities, the accelerations, the glide angles, all of these different things. Like how are they moving around in the X, Y, and Z plane? And we also recorded like the duration of their maneuvers, and the time between like an anatomical movement and a corresponding body rotation or something like that. And we're going to walk through what they can do one by one. This is one of my favorite parts. It's kind of like going back and rediscovering it all over again. Hang on, try not to hit it too many times. The first thing that we noticed when we dropped them in, before we got a chance to slow things down, there was an obvious visual difference in real time. So in real time, we could see that these Aenetes vagrant, the wandering salamander, and Aenetes lugubrious, they were in control at all times in the wind tunnel. They never thrashed or flailed around, and they never just dropped like a brick and just like tumbled. So they were always able to right themselves. They were always making maneuvers, and they were always kind of controlling their descent. I actually analyzed these videos doing this species first, then I moved to this one. And when I got to this one, we actually had to make a new behavior category because for the first time, we saw wild flashing in the wind tunnel or thrashing. So not until you get to this one, the third one on that arboreality gradient, do you see lack of control, freaking out, thrashing, things like that. And not until you get to Ensatina, the totally non-arboreal salamander, do you see what I call an inert fall, where they don't do anything. They just sit there as if they're sitting on the ground and they tumble, and they do backflips. So one thing that was obvious before we even did any math at all was that the level of control in terms of behavioral frequency was just insanely different between the arboreal and the non-arboreal species. So almost as important as the fact that they do things in the air is the fact that they don't do uncontrolled maneuvers in the air. So this was kind of telling to us. It was like Ensatina flails around and kind of tumbles, like does backflips. Maybe it's not doing that in nature. Maybe it's not evolved to control itself in the air. So this is the first thing that we noticed, that they control themselves in the roll plane. And what I hope to see here, other than the fact that the salamander kind of touches the plexiglass really quick, is that it's continuously rolling right, left, right, left, right, left. It's never just stable in the air, not moving. It's always kind of correcting itself, but it never lets itself flip over too much. So this is a certain level of control that we see in some organisms where they can just keep themselves upright. So this is kind of like the most basic level of like precursor to flight behavior or incipient flight behavior, if you will, where they're able to keep themselves upright in the roll plane. They do this by basically like, it says abducting and adducting limbs, but think of it as just like throwing your limb up and down. So everybody in the room can do this. You put your arms out. So put your arms out, don't be shy. Take your right arm and just put it down to your side really fast. Saw people going like different directions. I don't know who was right, who was wrong, but that's not important. What's important is I saw a lot of heads and necks move, right? So if you do this, there's almost like inertial movements that happen to the rest of your body. The salamanders depend on that stuff. So if they just kind of like move one leg a little bit this way, they roll that way. And if they take it the other way, they'll roll the other way. And so they're constantly doing this, if you will, to kind of stabilize themselves in the roll plane. When it comes to the pitch plane, they use the tail. And this is super common in like animals with tails that fall out of trees and do things in the air, where they'll pitch up and down, where like pitching your tail down pitches your nose up, and pitching your tail up pitches your nose down. And here you can see that the salamander like almost stops itself in midair and just starts pivoting back and forth. Again, this is very common. Like this is actually seen in Asian flat-tailed geckos and a lot of things that are known to glide. They don't just perfectly sit there stable. They're maneuverable. They rock back and forth. They control themselves in the roll and the pitch plane. They're in total control. Oh, too far. And if you simultaneously control your roll and your yaw, then you can actually make a turn. So they can yaw themselves, but more often than not, they actually roll a little bit while they're yawing. So this organism here, if you watch the back right leg, it tucks it in just a little bit, almost like a seagull that sees a fry and wants to make a turn and land on the beach for it, you know? So it tucks that limb just a little bit. It yaws and rolls in a banking turn. And then when it untucks the limb, so there's the tuck, there's the yaw. You see it speed up in momentum. Then it untucks and it slows down and stops yawing. And eventually it just kind of hits the plexiglass with no yaw at all. So they're combining their control of the roll and the yaw planes to bank turns, and this is exactly how tree frogs do it. So it's really cool that we're seeing not just that salamanders can control themselves in the air, but they're doing it in the same ways that we see tree frogs and geckos and other things like that controlling themselves in the air. So there's broader biological applicability here. This one's the Nevis vagrants, same exact video, same trial, just two different views. You've got like the frontal and the lateral view, and same thing. When it tucks the leg, you can see it start to rotate, and when it untucks, so right there, kind of tucks the leg there. There you go. Gives it a nice little rotate, turns at least 90 degrees, then it stops rotating. That's the key. So the fact that when they stop making the gestures, when they stop with the biomechanical movements, that the behavior stops as well. That is the control. If they were to bank a turn and tuck their leg, if when they untucked it, they just kept turning, that is not control. They're just flailing out of control at that point. But the fact that they can start and stop these aerial behaviors on their own without me reaching in there and helping them was indicating to us that these animals are in control. Just to add a few numbers to it, Nevis vagrants wasn't the only one to parachute, but it was certainly the most effective one at parachuting. So over 1 second in the wind tunnel, we had 5-second trials, but over a single second, they could slow themselves down by almost a meter per second. So if you're a salamander falling through the redwood canopy at 10 meters per second, in that very first second, you can make that 9 instead of 10. Doesn't seem like much, but that's significant, especially for aerial control. The other organisms that could do it, like Lungless, it was half as effective. And the other two, when they happened to parachute, whether that was on purpose or not, it was like a quarter of the effectiveness of the Nevis vagrants. So even though they can all do the behavior, they can't all do it as equally well. And Nevis vagrants also hold the parachute posture way longer. So sometimes they would hold it through like the whole 5-second trial, whereas the other ones would abandon the posture and try different things, turning and whatnot.
But that just makes sense because vagrants is the highest, not the species that goes highest.
Exactly. So it was exciting to see it.
Expected it's going to hold it
it almost has like an ecological application. Like it's almost holding it as long as it would fall in nature. Yeah. Well, that's a good, so 5 seconds, the wind tunnel trial, that would be about 50 meters of dropping. And so for vagrants, that's not even the whole canopy, right? Like you can go up 100 meters sometimes. So I love, yeah, that's a great observation that like the 5-second hold is kind of like more indicative of like what they're doing in nature. Yeah. But this one, so not only are they like skydiving and stuff like that, but they can also right themselves in the air. So I didn't mean to do this. I accidentally brought this one upside down, but you can see how it rapidly extends and rotates the tail, and that causes counter rotation of the body. We're working on describing all of that in a new paper, but this is super common in like gliding herpetofauna, amphibians, and reptiles, rotating the tail and getting the body to rotate in response. Yeah.
Where do they need to jump to? Do they need to drop down to the base of the tree, or are they jumping to another tree?
Not to another tree. We'll get to the glide angles in a minute, and we'll show the glide angles that like they really can't get to another tree. Oh, hang on. You pressed something there. We're back. Okay. So yeah, glide angles here. Don't want to stop the video. There we go. So this salamander is not just parachuting. It's kind of, it holds the skydiving posture here for a second, but then it starts pumping the tail up and down. This is a strategy we also see in Asian flat-tailed geckos, and it causes horizontal movement. So anytime an animal can like basically translate functional gravitational potential energy into like aerodynamic work, it's gliding. Doesn't matter if it's 50 degrees or 5 degrees or 80 degrees, it's all gliding. And so the fact that this animal can move horizontally in the wind tunnel without touching any walls or without touching my hand or anything like that means that if you were to drop it from the redwood tree, it could theoretically move horizontally. And what we found is that it can do this at about a meter per second. So again, it can slow itself down by about a meter per second, and it can also move horizontally by about a meter per second. So in that first second of falling from the tree, it's slowing itself down and potentially moving horizontally to intercept another branch or another fern mat, which is the question that we had here, where do they need to go? In many cases, it's probably just lower in the canopy, away from that barred owl, away from that squirrel, or whatever it is that's trying to eat you. You probably don't want to end up on the forest floor, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So these 84 and 85 degree glide angles that we found in these adult like arboreal salamanders are theoretically enough to keep it in the crown. This is actually a figure from Jim's research. So in Jim's master's, he plotted these red dots. He mapped these redwood crowns and plotted these red dots where he found salamanders. I came along and added the blue cones of possibility is what we call them. So if you draw an 84-degree glide angle from actual known salamander capture locations, these are the possible landing locations or interception points. And so you can see that most organisms would have a hard time actually getting back to the forest floor. Look at this one. If you drop or jump from here, you're going to intercept like lots of different branches and the trunk many different times before you can even reach the forest floor. And so what we're thinking is that these glide angles are indicating that they're going from fern mat to fern mat. And if we take a look at the canopy and we take a look at where the fern mats are oriented, a lot of times it is just a few degrees from one branch to another. If you were to drop straight down, you would miss it. But if you can just kind of cut yourself by a few degrees, you can intercept many more branches. And so that's indicated here. All of the dashed blue lines indicate like a perfectly straight fall with no glide. And then the outer edges count as like an 84-degree glide angle. So if they fell straight down from here, they might not intercept much, but if they glide, then they can hit the trunk. Basically, in theory, those angles should be enough to keep them in their habitat. And we've only talked about the one end of the spectrum, the arboreal ones that can do things. This is the Ensatina schultzii. So this is the forest floor dwelling salamander. This is our control species, and you can see that when we drop it, it doesn't extend the legs outward or above its body at all. So it's not assuming the skydiving posture. So if you don't assume the skydiving posture, you don't parachute, you don't glide, you don't do anything. In fact, you just kind of tumble. And so we saw this a lot in Ensatina, probably about 20% or more of the trials, it would do that. It would just kind of like tumble up and down. Sometimes it would thrash wildly. Very rarely did it ever do anything that was actually exhibiting any control. A few times I think it got lucky and parachuted. But yeah, they don't extend the legs in the same way, and they don't hold the same postures. And so what we found is that arboreal salamanders can right themselves in the air, they can bank turns, they can parachute, slowing themselves down up to 10%. They can glide at shallow or at very steep angles that are sufficient to keep them in the crown, but not enough to get them from tree to tree. And this aerial performance kind of follows an arboreality gradient, which is super cool. And the last thing that we noticed was that not only do they not thrash or tumble in the airstream, but the arboreal salamanders seem to resist climbing downward. So while I was testing all this stuff in the wind tunnel, I had a really brilliant undergraduate assistant who would ask the best questions. And she said, one time she said, why would you jump and risk all that, right? Like, why would you risk falling all the way out of your tree and separating yourself from your mates and your resources and stuff? What if there's no predation pressure? What if they just need to get somewhere? Is there an alternative method of descent? And I was like, that's such a good question, you should answer it. And so she did. So this is Jessalyn Arez's paper in Journal of Zoology. And she studied how wandering salamanders walk straight up and down walls. And the funniest part about her research was I checked on her one week and she was like, it's not working. And I was like, what do you mean it's not working? And she said, the salamanders won't walk down. And I was like, what are you talking about? They won't walk down. So I went into the lab and I was like, show me what's going on. And she put them on the board and positioned them downward and she'd tickle their tails and kind of tap and like create predation pressures. And the animal just wouldn't do it. It would occasionally, it would like turn around and walk upward. And then sometimes it would jump off the wall and just drop. Or sometimes it would just let go and just fall. And eventually she figured out how to get them to walk down, but it was like an unnatural thing for them to do. And then when she finally got around to analyzing the video, she noticed that when she got them to do this thing they obviously didn't want to do, they had to take super baby steps. So this is stride length on the y-axis, and this is their downward stride length versus horizontal flat ground versus upward. And you can see that when they're walking up trees and walking on flat ground, they're fine, they take the same strides. But when they have to walk down, gravity pulling on them as they walk down the tree is kind of a nuisance, and they have to take these little baby steps, and they also have to hold their feet in a funny way. And so what she basically found is that maybe they're dropping and parachuting and stuff like that to get from fern mat to fern mat, even if there's no predator around, just because it's super efficient. Why not take the gravity elevator is the way we like to say it now. So when she was done with her research, we started talking about the gravity elevator. If you don't take the gravity elevator, you have to take the stairs down the world's tallest tree. And you're a 5-gram animal that might be preyed upon and that might dry out. So it could be like, as we see less fog in the summertime and you're drying out as a salamander and you need to find more fog or more food, you can just drop down to the next fern mat below. It might not be an escape response to predation every single time, is kind of what Jess has discovered. So that's really, really neat. And that kind of wraps up like what we learned about like salamander gliding and the effectiveness of it in the crown. And the next question, or the next like reasonable question, was how the heck do they do that stuff? So it was very cool. Everybody lit up when we showed the videos of the gliding, but you can't glide if you don't have lift. And you can't do any of that stuff without a positive lift to drag ratio. I know all of that because for my dissertation, I had to stop studying salamanders for a while and read a bunch of like physics and books about like fluid dynamics, and it was miserable. But at the end, I was enlightened. I came out like making all these new connections, and I'm really glad that I did it. One of the connections that I made thanks to NASA is that even though they talk about airplanes and spaceships, I was just able to plug in salamanders, and they talk about how the shape and the size of the object is super important for lift. Remember earlier we talked about how morphology is basically just shape and size, and how these animals have wildly different size and shaped feet and legs, which could be important when you're in a parachute skydiving posture, right? So I read a book called Life in Moving Fluids as well that kind of talks about how air is basically just water with different viscosity. And so if you want to think about this, there are animals in the flow of water that can also do cool things and just kind of ride currents. And so we kind of have to think about the air like water. And we had to kind of look at this thing from a physical perspective and stop talking about salamanders for a second and just talk about like physics. And because of what we read in Vogel and what we read about like aerodynamics, we hypothesized that the flatter salamanders and the ones with longer limbs and bigger feet create more lift. Got it. All right. Well, moving on. So the first thing that we did here, did I do something wrong?
No, no.
Okay, cool. The first thing that we did is we just did like a traditional morphometrics analysis. So we took out the calipers and we basically measured every part about the salamander. We measured how big their legs were. We measured how long they were. And what we found is, if you compare that arboreal species Aenetes vagrans, which lives above our heads here in the redwoods, it's the one living on the forest floor, they have roughly equal tail lengths, but we see big differences in the forelimb length, the hind limb length, the distance that they're able to get their limbs away from their center of mass, which is important for aerodynamics. And then lastly, we see that they're far more flattened. So what I did to get dorsal ventral flattening is basically a scale of 0 to 1. I divided their body width by their body height. And if you get a value of 0, it means you're perfectly flat like a piece of paper. And if you get a value of 1, it means you're perfectly round like a hot dog. And so Ensatina is closer to being perfectly round like a hot dog. It's 0.8. So that's closer to 1 than anything else. Whereas vagrant is closer to being a half a hot dog because it's flattened. And if you read those physics textbooks, it'll tell you that a cylinder versus a half a cylinder have wildly different aerodynamic properties. So this could be the morphological smoking gun. We know that behaviorally, it's the parachute posture and the things that they're doing in the tunnel. But maybe there's some morphology that allows all that to work on top of behavior that Ensatina just doesn't have. And this was kind of like cool, all right, maybe it is the flattening and that does tie into the textbooks, but traditional morphometrics are super limiting because the textbooks were also saying things like, what's the surface area of your shuttle? What's the volume of your shuttle? And these are very hard measurements to get with calipers on a salamander. So what I did for surface area and volume, I actually turned to lasers. So if you take lasers and you scan the salamanders with lasers, and you use these modern softwares, you can actually build 3D meshes. I did this with the help of Alex Kirk at USF. He studies Archaeopteryx. So the thing that he studies is extinct. So all of his work has to be done with like lasers and reconstruction. So I said, hey, why don't we do it with this salamander? So we laser scanned Ensatina, and we laser scanned the wandering salamander, and we basically created them in 3 dimensions in a digital world with all the same properties they have in real life. And I was able to measure surface area and volume and things like that. And the other cool thing we were able to do is we were able to run computational fluid dynamics. And computational fluid dynamics is just a fancy way of saying we simulated airflow over these salamanders a bunch. And so you've probably seen stuff like this on car commercials. They'll be like sculpting a clay Volkswagen and then they like flow air over it to see how aerodynamic the Volkswagen is. This is essentially what we did with the salamanders. We're investigating how the shape of their Volkswagen, or their body, plays with the air around them and how that might account for lift and drag. What we found after 10,000 iterations is that Aenetes vagrans has a positive lift coefficient. So this is their lift coefficient. Positive, and Ensatina has a negative lift coefficient, so that's pretty revealing. The other thing that we found is that the lift to drag ratio in vagrants is pretty high, especially compared to Ensatina. So if you have a high lift to drag ratio, you can take off. If you're an airplane and you have enough pressure under the wing and you have a big enough pressure differentiation between below the wing and above the wing, then your airplane can take off. And that's exactly the way that it's working with the salamanders. There's a pressure gradient between their belly and their back. And the gradient is much larger in vagrants compared to Ensatina. And it's probably like that because they're more flattened. So the pressure gradient being greater basically translates to greater lift. And this all works up to an angle of attack of about 5 to 10 degrees, and then it starts to not work so much anymore, which might be why the animal pivots back and forth a lot and doesn't let itself go too far in any direction. The lasers also allow me to get surface area and volume, which is exciting, and we found that Aenetes vagrans also have a much greater surface area to volume ratio. So they're able to, more of their body, more of their surface area, or they have more surface area, I should say, to play with the air around them and make movements. Whereas Ensatina has less of that body on the outside and more of it on the inside. Another thing that we found is that the feet on vagrants are way bigger. So we looked at like the millimeter squared area of the ventral side of their feet. And we found that vagrants has huge hind feet compared to Ensatina, and even much larger forefeet. The pressure gradient I was talking about was indeed different and bigger, so 153.7 compared to 126.8, and the lift coefficient is higher in vagrants as well. So these are things we were able to get with like some new like laser technology and stuff like that, which I thought was kind of cool. And we'll kind of talk about how we could use that technology to teach us more in the future. But what we found from this last part of my dissertation basically is that we knew behaviorally the salamanders were different. We had already described that from the wind tunnel, but now we know morphologically arboreal salamanders are special. They're more flattened, they have longer feet or like longer legs and bigger feet, and they have a greater pressure gradient that accounts for more lift. And they also can do this up to an angle of attack of about 5 degrees before their lift to drag coefficients start to do them a disservice. So they're much better oriented at 0, 5, and -5 degrees than anything else. So this is kind of getting us to like the whole who cares thing, right? If you scan salamanders with lasers long enough, you might lose sight of that. But if you take a step back, it's really cool what we've done. This is a figure from Nature News and Views, and it's not suggesting that salamanders are some kind of stepping stone to flapping flight, or that someday, if we waited millions of years, there would be flapping salamanders. That's not what it's saying at all. It's just saying that there's this whole world of organisms out there, winged and non-winged, and this kind of helps us fill a gap. There was a missing link between the non-winged and the winged animals and how they aerodynamically support their body weight. So it's not saying that like salamanders will someday lead to flapping flight, but it is a cool way to show that these generalized tetrapods with almost no morphological specialization can aerodynamically support their body weight. And we can learn a lot from that. I think by digging into salamanders more. So I told you about 4 salamanders out of 497 described lungless salamanders. And if you take a look at the proportion of arboreal salamanders in temperate forests like the redwoods, it's only 2%. It's really only like 3 species that are like obviously arboreal. So temperate environments aren't really the ones where we see this arboreality. Where we see it is tropical environments. So you don't think about Mexico when you think about lungless salamanders, but they have a huge chunk of that diversity in Mexico. Polydoglossans live on banana trees. There are some species that live in bromeliads up in the canopy. You can see where I'm going with this. They live high in the air. They have very webbed feet, and they're pretty small salamanders. So I think what we need to do, basically, is take this a step further and study way more species of Plethodontidae. There's 497 of them, and I don't have to waste my time traveling the world collecting live salamanders. If you go to the Smithsonian, they have thousands of salamanders in jars from previous scientists. So I could just take the salamanders that are just collecting dust on the shelves, and I could scan and predict their aerial behaviors using this method. They don't have to be, live salamanders from today. They could be 100 years old, it doesn't matter. And once I get the lift and drag coefficient estimates, then I'll know if potentially there's anything special about that animal or not. If there is, I can go find it, collect it, test it in the wind tunnel, and confirm. And if we do this enough, we might actually start to be able to model like how salamanders glide or what features of salamanders allow them to glide. And if we can do that, we can apply that to tetrapods more generally. So again, these are very like basic body forms: 2 arms, 2 legs, a body, a head, and a tail. So if we can figure out how the environment and the morphology of those salamanders and their genes are all playing together to come up with these forms, to inspire these gliding forms of animals, and we could learn about biology more generally and how life changes on Earth more generally. Another cool thing is that it kind of fits into an already working puzzle of gliding and aerial herpetofauna. So here is Mollus's flying frog. This is the Chinese flying frog. So we've got a couple of frogs that we knew could glide. This one was actually like one of the earliest organisms to be appreciated for this. Wallace wrote a note about this in 1855. He was like sitting in the forest of Borneo. He's a famous evolutionary biologist, and he wrote that it seemed to like fly from the tree crowns or glide from the tree crowns as if flying. And so this is Wallace's flying frog. These Chinese flying frogs do a lot of the same maneuvers like banking turns by adducting a hind limb and things like that. There's also a lot of lizards that can do this. Draco is highly specialized, so not necessarily like our A vagrants, but this one is the Asian flat-tailed gecko, and when I read papers on that, it sounds almost exactly like what A vagrants does in the wind tunnel. They pump their tail up and down, they glide sideways, they hold a parachute posture to slow themselves down, they right themselves by whipping their tail around. So we're actually writing a review paper right now about how a lot of these things do things similarly in the air. And there are even gliding snakes, believe it or not. And if you haven't seen the videos of those, you've got to check them out. Jim has seen them in person, so you can ask him about that too. But the cool thing about these is we're not just like building a puzzle for fun. This puzzle tells us about life. It tells us about life on Earth. And scientists have found that all the scientists didn't find this, but all the organisms I'm showing you here are from the same region of the planet. These all evolved in these southeastern Asian dipterocarp forests. And they actually did a study and they found that there's something going on with these forests. Like the way these forests are seems to be inspiring gliding flight animals. So the fact that we see gliding snakes, frogs, and lizards all coming out of the same region of Earth is not a coincidence, according to these scientists. There are features of the forest that lead to gliding and really cool adaptations. Which brings us back home. Even though those forests in southeastern Asia are very, very different in many ways, one's tropical, here we're temperate, they're also very similar in a lot of ways. So even though one's tropical and one's temperate, they're both rainforests. We're here in a temperate rainforest starting in Klamath, going all the way up to Alaska. And that's where these salamanders live. So the fact that we're a rainforest, that's one similarity. The fact that we have really tall tree canopies, right? These pterocarp forests in Southeast Asia have really tall trees and tall canopies. We have that here as well, I'm told. And so, yeah, we've got a lot of similarities. The Draco lizard that I showed you on the last slide, it actually needs really tall trees to glide, because when it first falls out of the tree, it drops straight down. And once it gains enough momentum, then it can start gliding. So tall trees actually are kind of a prerequisite to a lot of these organisms. And we have those here. And the last thing that they talk about in the paper is that in these Southeastern Asian forests, you see boom and bust resource cycling. So one day there's food everywhere, and the next day there's none. And the organisms need an efficient way to get from one place to another when there's no food. And this is kind of what's driving the evolution of gliding in Southeastern Asia. And I think we have this stuff here. If you go into the canopy now, as a salamander, you don't need to move. There's springtails and water everywhere. But if you come back in August, or in one of our drought years, that could be very different. So we have boom and bust resource cycling in the redwoods. Water is one of the resources that boom and bust. And then inverts kind of boom and bust right with it. So springtails, columella, and things that salamanders eat. So all of these things could be driving gliding evolution, because we have officially 2 flying animals from our local redwood trees already. This is the Humboldt flying squirrel, which I've been told the zoo knows all about. I read some stuff on the zoo's website about the Humboldt flying squirrel, the research they're funding on that. And now we have, if you will, the Humboldt flying salamander. And so what else is out there? You know what I mean? Like, what else is in the canopy that can do cool stuff that we underestimated? And not just in our canopy, but how does that tie into the rest of the world? And how are redwoods inspiring really cool adaptations in animals? Because there are other canopy walkways. So we are here at Eureka Sequoia Park Zoo, where we have a brand new, beautiful walkway, which might be fun for recreating, but they're not just used for recreation. So this is a gliding ant from Peru, and this is the canopy walkway that's used for science. And this is the visual arena, kind of like a visual board that the scientists made to try and discover what are these ants queuing into when they glide. So what they found is when you drop the ants from the ground, 85% of the time they land back on the trunk and walk right back up. So they saved themselves that big fall on the ground where they could be eaten, and they saved themselves the long walk by gliding back to the trunk. When they set up this color wall, they found that the ants always glide towards like yellow and white and lighter colors. And if you look around in the forest, that's what the trees look like. So the ants are vertically orienting themselves while they fall, using the tree they fell out of, and then trying to glide back to it. Salamanders could be doing something similar, but that's not really the point. The point is that this stuff happens on these canopy walkways. They discovered gliding ants, they discovered gliding spiders, terrifying, right? And they even discovered that stick insects can right themselves and do really cool things in the air. I'm not sure that they can glide, but they can right themselves, and they have some control of these stick insects when they fall out of the trees. This is all from one canopy walkway in Peru. And if you go, over to Costa Rica, there's another canopy walkway at the La Selva Biological Station. You can see here students like photographing and learning from the trees, like right up in the canopy without being on rope, no risk. And if you go to the other side of the world, this one is FIRM, the Forest Research Institute of Malaysia. And again, lots of science done on this every year, especially on some of those Southeastern Asian gliding species. And so I'm reading these papers, and I'm always like, reading that the scientists, I dropped it from such and such canopy walkway. I dropped my animals from such and such canopy walkway. And I'm making the connections. We have a walkway here. So wouldn't it be really cool to learn more about the redwood canopy using our walkway, and then also connect us to the rest of the world? How are redwood forests like Southeastern Asian forests? How are redwood forests like the things that we see in Malaysia? We could actually collaborate with those scientists who work at those research stations, and we could collaborate with local scientists at Cal Poly Humboldt and try to kind of learn more about canopy life in general, not just in California and not just in the redwoods. And one thing that could be our little calling card here is the fog reduction issue. So with climate change, anything could happen, but they are predicting a reduced summer fog for the coast region, and especially the coast redwood region. And this could be devastating for the fern mat ecosystems and communities that we talked about, but we won't know that if we don't do any monitoring or any data collection. So I don't know if anybody's doing it yet, but I think Sequoia Park Zoo, with their canopy walkway, should totally be monitoring the canopy ecosystem over the next few decades to centuries, seeing how the fern mats are doing, seeing how the salamanders are doing, and seeing how all of that ties back into fog decline and a changing climate. And so using these salamanders, which are highly mobile and will not hesitate to jump out of the crowd if they don't like it, as sentinels or canaries in the coal mine could be a really good idea because it's something we already do on the ground. So if you go to Green Diamond's website and you go to the research tab and responsible forestry, you can see they're already doing this with 2 different salamanders. This one, they worry about it drying out once they clear the trees. Too much sun comes in and they dry out. And then this one, they worry about sedimentation. Once they log, the rivers get too silty and sedimenty. So basically, they're using salamanders as canaries in the coal mine to determine whether or not the ecosystem is still functioning. We could do the same thing in the trees using the walkway and the salamanders that someday may move in. And with that, I'll let you guys get back to your lives because I know it's late. And so I really got to thank the Fern Gardens of Odessa. They've been great in funding me, the Tharp Fellowship. Jim Campbell-Spickler, I know he took my research and took it to a whole new level, but without Jim, none of this would have been possible. Not just the documentaries, but like all of my work was built on Jim's data. So we just keep like building on each other as scientists. So I hope somebody else can come along and build on my work. Will Goldenberg is local here. If you've ever worked with him on films, he's amazing. And I have to thank some other scientists for helping me and giving me some data. And with that, I'd love to take, I would love to take your questions, or you can always email them here if you're shy. Or check out the website, skydivingsalamander.com. Yeah, and that's it. Okay. Good, awesome.
I'm not familiar with what makes up the fern mats. What the species and how does that compare to maybe, I don't know, are there fern mats on the ground that other salamanders rock on? I mean,
That's a good question.
how do they ever end up in the trees?
The fern mats themselves,
No.
the salamanders. Yeah, so how they got there is a much trickier question because it probably happened 50 to 65 million years ago, or sorry, with the Nevis vagrants, it was a lot earlier, but or a lot later. But yeah, the fern mats themselves are mostly composed of Polypodium schooleri, which is the leatherleaf fern. So if you read some of Steve Sillett's work on the canopy fern mats up there, they actually like cut a bunch of them down, took them back to the lab and dissected them and dried them out and weighed them and figured out exactly what % of the fern mat is what. And if you count dead rhizomes, dead fronds, live rhizomes, if you count all the parts of this leatherleaf fern, it comprises more than 50% of the entire mat. So there are other species and stuff like that, and there is like arboreal humus that forms from all the redwood duff, following over hundreds and even like over 1,000 years sometimes. But the fern mat itself is like mostly leatherleaf fern, arboreal humus, and then there's all kinds of plants like huckleberries and spruce and things that will come take root after that. But it's really that leatherleaf fern that's the pioneer that kind of roots into the bark, starts gathering loose debris and starts building soil and building that ecosystem.
Are those found on the ground?
No, they're not found on the ground. You can find them actually like on your roof if it's been raining for decades and you haven't done anything to it. I saw one on the roof of one of their utility sheds here at the zoo, and I'm like, I'm gonna put that in the walkway. So they do form anywhere off the ground like that, but on the ground, not necessarily. Polypodium schooleri really only grows in like coastal salt spray on the cliffs, and then also like up in the canopy, tree branches and stuff like that. On the ground, you get like sword ferns instead, and that's the Ensitinas layer, you know? Ensitinas live under the sword ferns, vagrants live up in the trees with the leatherleaf ferns. Yeah.
And they breed, they lay eggs up there, and
They do.
they never have to go down to the ground.
We haven't found, like there's no evidence that they have to come down. And in fact, Jim has a lot of tagged animals from his master still that we still check on, and we have no evidence that they've gone down, but it's possible they went down and came back up and we missed it or something. So like, we don't know for sure, but there's a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that they don't come down as adults, and that it's bad for them to come down. And every year that goes by, it's just getting more and more likely that like they could be spending their whole lives up there. Reproduction for sure. This whole discovery was based on one of Hart Welch's like observations. He found a down redwood tree, checked the fern mat, and there were eggs inside of it. And he took the eggs back to what's now Cal Poly Humboldt or Redwood Science Lab or whichever one. And when they hatched, they were any of these vagrants. So Hart Welch was the first one to say, I think vagrants is living in the canopy. And it was actually based on egg observations. So they do reproduce up there.
And does anybody know what the lifespan
It's about 20 years from what I've been able to find. Most Platodons can live about 20 years or so. There's some salamanders in the Rockies that can live over 40, we're finding, so. Other questions? Yes.
Seems like epiphytic plants. You know, some of your studies about the drop of the salamander, the epiphytic plants like in tropical forest, they have all different kinds of designs of leaves, but they have very short roots. They're not meant to stay in the crooks of trees. They're actually designed to eventually fall out and find new rooting soil, you know. But why have that many different types of leaf shapes? You know, why are there so many? They must have different fall radiuses. And then depending on how much of the stem is attached, or is there a rhizome attached, or is it a needle-like shape? And so they all must have different functions for where they're going to fall. That's what I was thinking about looking at your graphs.
Yeah.
And they are rhizomes and begonias.
So maybe the plants are shaped to fall.
They are designed to fall, but like they grow to fall. Eventually, the branch is not going to support them, and their roots are too short, but they store their own water to prepare for a trip. That's rhizomes and begonias.
Wow.
But other ones are not. They're like little needle shaped. And so I was looking at your graphs and thinking about how much that applies to rhizomes. What do you call it? What was it? They grow in the trees. In other words.
Well, there's a paper. You'll love this paper we're working on right now. It's not by me, it's by someone else. And it's all about the aerial control of things going from seed pods of plants all the way through salamanders to mammals and stuff like that. So it's kind of a giant review of aerial writing and stuff, but they talk about that. And there's a few botanists who have written about that, about how seeds have, or the seeds of a plant are shaped.
Pods, yes.
Exactly, to naturally write themselves.
Uh-huh.
And so we're kind of comparing that to like salamanders and lizards and frogs, and exactly. So you're kind of onto something there that it's groundbreaking. Yeah, definitely. I'll call you when it comes out. Yeah. Any other questions?
Well, I am in my.
Yes.
8 after, so if
Cool.
anyone would like to go, we can stick around and ask some more questions. We have a couple online questions too. if you
Oh yeah,
want to answer them.
absolutely.
But I did want to let folks go. I see some giggling in the back, so I'm guessing our skunk friend is at the back door.
Oh,
So the residents, the restroom, since you have to go right past her, but.
so cool. Yeah, and if you're heading out, just thank you so much for coming. I mean, it means everything to see face.
Thanks, everybody.
Try to
And I just, yeah, I was gonna say, it is we have our calendar up there at the door, and our lecture is free, so there's no obligation to donate. But if you do wish to donate, our green basket is up there, and that helps support our conservation fund, which puts on these lectures and funds our conservation grants, and we donate to other conservation projects. So you guys can exit out that gate, but I have some other questions. Our game.
Of course.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, get your water. So Carly asks, she's got someone, how do you spell the costal?
I'm sorry, yeah, I should have shown a better picture of that. It's just COSTAL. It's basically the big lines and muscles that you see on the sides of the salamanders. We call them folds, and then between them are costal grooves, and those are often used in like identification and morphology. Yeah.
And Sherman asks, did any salamanders die from the experiments?
No, yeah. So the other thing, we looked into that before doing the experiments because we didn't want to, we didn't want that to happen. But interestingly enough, if you study aerodynamics, most animals that fall reach terminal velocity within that first second. So dropping a salamander 5 feet versus 500 feet is no different, basically, because they're going to reach terminal velocity. It's the same speed, same mass. Kind of like those old high school physics experiments where they would drop like a bowling ball and a basketball at the same time and show that they fall at the same speed. So it's kind of, yeah, they didn't die because terminal velocities reached extremely quickly. Yeah, but we thought about that. And I also work with IACUC on both at USF and at UC Berkeley. And so we're double, triple covered on terms like animal welfare and things like that, yeah.
And Ken would like to know, this is a little bit of a longer question, but does there seem to be seasonality in salamander height? So I assume where they are in the canopy, perhaps related to environmental conditions like fog, rain, temperature, wind. And then the second part of that is there's evidence that climate change is changing. No, go ahead. Well,
The first part, amazing question. So that's kind of, I'll try to look at the camera in case you're there. Yeah, so that's an amazing question. And that's something that Jessa's work is really kind of getting us to think more about, right? So there is seasonality in terms of the use of the canopy. And we do know, based on a lot of botanical studies, that the upper crown dries out much faster than the lower crown. The lower crown has bigger and moister fern mats, and the upper crown has smaller and drier fern mats. So one thing that we're thinking is, if they are dropping and jumping without predator cues, it's possible that this is a strategy for moving around when summer hits, when that dry season finally hits. If you're a young salamander and you spent the rainy season feeling good and exploring your redwood tree, and you don't know a dry season's coming and it happens to hit and you're stuck at the top of that tree, it might be really efficient to just drop down to the next fern mat, because in theory it's bigger and wetter. And if you keep dropping from fern mat to fern mat, you should just be hitting bigger and wetter fern mats as you go down through the crown. So yes, there is a difference in upper to lower crown in terms of moisture. Yes, that's very important for the salamanders. We don't have any evidence of like migrations yet, but there could be a really cool study on that. Yeah, I think that's a good question.
Cool. And he also said there is evidence that climate change is changing morphometrics of birds. How do you think it might be affecting arboreal salamander morphometrics? And do you have enough museum material to examine that type of question?
How is it affecting salamanders? Don't know. So that's the reason why we need to do more monitoring in the canopy skywalk here, just kind of like measure that over time. And then the second part of the question was,
Is there enough museum material maybe you could look at?
There's a lot of museum material. The problem is it's all kind of from the same century. So a lot of salamanders are from 1900 to 2000. And so I don't know that we would capture that change in there, but it's a good question. And if it's happening in birds, then it could be happening in salamanders too, but I don't know that I have the resolution on the data to study that.
All right.
That's a really good question.
Isabella would like to know, what did you say the max glide angle of vagrants were?
That's a good question, because I didn't mention it. I didn't want to get like caught in the details here, but I only measured adult A vagrants. In theory, the juveniles should be able to glide even better, because the lighter you are, the higher your Reynolds number. And so like the better you're able to kind of aerodynamically affect your body weight. And so we only tested fully grown adults, and the best glide angle we observed was 83.5 degrees, with 90 being a straight fall. And so it's pretty steep, but like I said, I like that question, because what hasn't been done yet, what needs to be done someday, is a scaling study where we test salamanders at all different sizes, from juveniles all the way up to adults. And we very well may see like 80 degrees, 79 degrees in those juveniles because they're smaller. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Right. Oh, go ahead. Oh,
No, yeah, thanks for coming.
thank you. All right, we're running out of time, so I'm sure we've got.
Yeah, or email me, or I think we're going to run the curtains. So if you want to come and grab a beer, the one in Arcata. Yeah, if you're sitting in Eureka, wondering where I'm at, I'm in Arcata. Yeah, thanks everybody online. Thank you. Thanks, Leah.